Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking once again with Dan Lazare. Dan has written several articles for the blog. He's also published several books, including The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, which discuss the Constitution. He's also published another book, I believe The War on Our Cities, which ties in a lot of this stuff into urban development and so on and so forth. I wanted to start off by asking where you're head these days when you're looking around and observing the world. What are you thinking about?
Well, I think we're living through a remarkable period. I think both globally and nationally. I think that globally, obviously Trump is carving out a completely new national strategy, go-it-alone strategy in which the U.S. confronts the world. He has little interest maintaining NATO. He obviously wants to make a deal with Russia, and he's looking for some kind of confrontation with China. We have no idea how that will turn out. And meanwhile, in concert with Israel, he is carving out a very aggressive policy in the Middle East. So that's really quite remarkable. And what's happening internally is equally so. Essentially, it's very hard to tell. I thought it would if we're in a dictatorship or not. But we are certainly sort of crossing into a dictatorship at this point. Trump is defying the courts, and the Supreme Court is refusing to hold him to account. So essentially, it looks like he has the Supreme Court's backing in essentially shutting down judicial resistance. Trump's poll numbers are holding up fairly well, but the Democrats' poll numbers are just rock bottom. Whether or not people are happy or unhappy with Trump, they are united in their contempt for the Democratic Party. So therefore, resistance has essentially collapsed. No one knows what to do. We have seen some very important demonstrations, the No Kings protests. Even more important were the demonstrations in Los Angeles over the Trump's, immigration sweeps. So those suggest that things will get rockier and rockier in terms of events on the ground, but we'll have to see what happens.
Let's dive in a little bit maybe to the Supreme Court ruling around birthright citizenship. It was looming for a little while. I think it took a few months for them to hand down their decision. And then, it's been treated as a very big decision. You wrote something that I thought was interesting, not just around the decision itself, but also looking at the 3 liberal justices who dissented and what they talked about in their dissent. Could you talk a little bit about that ruling?
Yeah. Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote the dissent, and she's one of the three liberals in the court, and her argument was very interesting. Essentially, she argued from a straight-out judicial supremacy point of view, and that is, we have this Constitution, which everybody's got to obey, and the court's job is to protect that Constitution, to determine, when it's violated, and to issue injunctions when the executive branch steps out of line. Sounds very simple. It's the same principle behind a traffic stop. If you're speeding, if you violate the traffic laws, a cop stops you, gives you a fine, and you have your day in court. So that's essentially the view she was addressing. But it's really fundamentally untenable for a lot of reasons. Number one is that there are 677 federal district court judges in the country, and the idea that each one has the power to halt the government policy whenever they want is extraordinary. These universal injunctions that the judges have been issuing have been increasing in numbers since the 80s and 90s. They reached the point under the Biden administration that whenever the administration set out to do something significant, they had to have their lawyers ready because they knew a federal judge somewhere would issue an injunction stopping them. So essentially, the judiciary was asserting its authority in a more and more sweeping fashion and really kind of nullifying, popular self-government. And Jackson defended this, and Amy Coney Barrett got off a very good rejoinder to Jackson's arguments, which was that Jackson thinks the answer to an imperial presidency is an imperial judiciary. Barrett, of course, Barrett is hypocritical because she's defending a dictatorial presidency, but nonetheless, she did put her finger on the problem. Which is it going to be, an imperial presidency or an imperial judiciary? And the fact that the judges are not elected, they are not beholden to the public in any way, makes it quite clear what the public stance will be. The public will essentially back Trump in these kinds of cases. So I think that what Jackson's argument really illustrates is how, due to this increasingly assertive and an imperialistic judiciary, America is collapsing into executive branch dictatorship, where the executive branch rejects any role by the judiciary and insists on its right to make policy on its own say-so. And I think that's what's happening. As checks and balances break down, as separation of powers breaks down, we're moving towards a outrightly authoritarian system.
Well, it's that sort of double bind that you lay out that I think is one of the interesting parts, sort of saying, well, on the one hand, we have this undemocratic option, and then the alternative that the liberal justices are posing by propping themselves up is this other undemocratic option. So we remain trapped within this sphere of lacking democracy, if you will.
Of course, and as you and I know, the Constitution that Jackson bases her authority on is not a democratic document. That is the whole problem. I mean, is shockingly undemocratic. That could go through the ways, but you know it as well as I do. We have a Senate based on equal state representation, despite population differences of somewhere around 68 or 69 to 1. That means that the 54% of the country that lives in the 10 biggest states are outvoted 4-1 by the minority in the other 40. We have a gerrymandered House. We have an electoral college that is biased towards white, rural, underpopulated states, and we have a Supreme Court, which is a joint production of the Electoral College and the Senate, which is ultra-conservative, intent on taking away rights that Americans have enjoyed for decades, most notably abortion, and there's zero accountability, zero. There's nothing the public can do. I mean, as things stand now, under the best of circumstances, this 6-3 ultra-conservative majority, which is not representative of the people at all, will continue well into the 2030s. And there is nothing that the people can do. They're being governed without their consent. It's an absolutely outrageous situation. So this is what Jackson was basing her authority on, and it just doesn't work.
I wanted to ask about the No Kings protests and just reflect on those a little bit. Let's see. It would have been about a month ago or so that Trump was having his, well, some people would say a celebration for Flag Day. Other people would say a celebration for the military. Others, a celebration for his birthday, this big military parade in downtown D.C. And that happened on the same day as the No Kings marches, or the same weekend, I should say, as many No Kings marches were planned. It also happened in the context of the protests against ICE raids in Los Angeles. And I had a sense, maybe from reading a few too optimistic articles or so on, that weekend marked something of a shift, at least in terms of energy. This sense of, Trump's parade was really small. Our parades, our marches were really big. People are not happy with this. And then real quick, Trump bombs Iran. There's this ruling in his favor, and we seem to have just spun right back, marching along, so to speak. So there's a lot to unpack there. But the No Kings protests and the No Kings movement, what do you make of this?
Well, the No Kings strategy, I think, is actually problem. The No Kings slogan is problematic. Clearly, it's a reference to July 4th, 1776. It's a celebration of the U.S. Constitution. You have the U.S. American Revolution. I mean, what it says in effect is America overthrew George III in 1776, and we shouldn't allow King Donald to take his place in 2025. It's patriotic. It's nostalgic. It makes more of the American Revolution than I think should be made. And I think there also was a good deal of constitutional rhetoric in those protests. Save our, hands off our Constitution, save our Constitution, etc. So the general tone is this patriotic opposition that calls for returning things to the status quo ante, putting the Constitution back on the pedestal, turning the clock back to the glorious days of Joe Biden when we had a zombie in the Oval Office, and it's just not going to wash. And I think that's why they really actually ended up having remarkably little impact. I think the Los Angeles protests were much more impressive. And I think because they really were an uprising by working class people in Los Angeles against these draconian sweeps that Trump is mounting. And I think that what is Trump? He's the big beautiful bill allocates $350 million for anti-money activities. I mean, as he revs up this machine and it grows ever more aggressive, I think we're going to see an ever greater response and a greater and greater showdown in the streets. And I think that's very, very important. I commend the people of Los Angeles, working class people of Los Angeles, for fighting back. Though I point out, that they can't do it alone. They've got to enlist the broader working class in the U.S. to fight this. But I think that process is starting to get underway. And by the way, also what was really interesting is that those LA protests were implicitly against the Democratic Party because they were fighting the police who were sent there by Karen Bass, the Democratic mayor of Los Angeles, which is good too.
Yeah, it's sort of low-hanging fruit in a way, but I wrote something about how Gavin Newsom and then the Attorney General of California were going on TV and making speeches about, resisting Trump and the National Guard and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, making it very clear that we have plenty of police here to just knock as many teeth as we need to. We've got the LA County Sheriff's Department, which is just rife with corruptions and scandals and so on and so forth. The LAPD is a whole other story.
No, that was an excellent article. It put its finger, you put your finger on the problem. That is, essentially Karen Bass's message is we don't need federal troops because we can repress these protests perfectly well on our own. By sending out the LAPD, which is notorious for its brutality. And so, so therefore the people on the streets found themselves, facing, battling both wings of the ruling class. And I think that was really impressive. Very, very brave on their part, but I believe it is a harbinger of things to come.
Let's turn to Iran and talking about Trump's bombing of Iran. That also has, well, it seems like, so many other events have happened since then. But that event also got couched in, predictably, this language around, is it constitutional? Is it not constitutional? What's going on? And it seems to me like that type of language is just sort of a dead end, if you will. Trump is seemingly just going to do what he wants, and then, putting it in terms of constitutional, not constitutional, is always pulling us back into, well, what does the Constitution say? But to add on to that, for as much hubbub as there was around what's going to happen right after Trump, bombs these three missile sites, seemingly not much has happened. So just curious around that.
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think the constitutional question is really fascinating. I think that what the Constitution says and what it means are not quite the same thing. And for constitutional scholars, it's really it's a really fascinating question. I mean, the Constitution says that Congress shall declare war. But the fact is that has been abrogated from the very beginning. I think it goes back to Jefferson, who in 1803 sent the U.S. Marines. I mean, this new military force to battle the Ottomans in what is now Libya, who were threatening U.S. shipping and U.S. personnel. The Marine Corps hymn says, "From the Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli," that actually celebrates that engagement. And Jefferson did it on his own authority. And since then, there have been hundreds, literally hundreds of such episodes. So while the Constitution says Congress shall declare war, what the implicit subtext is that, well, yeah, but the executive branch can do whatever the hell it wants to do short of war. And unless Congress takes action, it has free reign up to a point. And the implicit understanding is that if the battle gets too serious, then the executive branch has got to seek a declaration from Congress. But otherwise, the implicit message is that the executive branch has a great deal of latitude, and the Democrats know that as well as the Republicans. And in fact, the Democrats never objected when Barack Obama was droning targets in 7 Muslim majority countries, when he was having regular Tuesday morning meetings to decide who to assassinate next. They didn't object when Hillary Clinton organized a NATO air war against Gaddafi's Libya, or when she organized a proxy war effort on the part of the U.S., UK, France, and Saudi Arabia to overthrow the government of Syria. So the hypocrisy is just amazing. But that's the way the whole constitutional system works. I mean, checks and balances are great when they benefit our side, whatever our side may be, and they're always an abuse of power when the other side uses them to block policies that your party wants. So it's just a monumental exercise in hypocrisy. So the Democrats objected, and they took heart from the CNN report that the effect of the bombing campaign was actually fairly minor. That CNN report is almost certainly false. And since then, the protests have died away, because what it looks like is that essentially Trump has accomplished a goal that Jimmy Carter laid out in January 1980 when he promulgated the so-called Carter Doctrine, which was written by Zbig Brzezinski, in which he declared that the Persian Gulf was to be henceforth an American lake. And it looks like Trump has finally accomplished that. The last anti-American bastion on the Gulf, and now he completely dominates the region, the U.S. and Israel. He dominates the region from the Atlantic, from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea. That is a 2,000-mile stretch of territory with roughly somewhere around half the world's known oil and gas reserves, and that's an accomplishment on the part of U.S. imperialism, and the Democrats understand that, which is why they're being silent, and which is why Trump now is seemingly going from strength to strength. So Trump essentially accomplished an imperialist triumph, which is why he seems to be doing so well these days.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think about him kind of seemingly going from triumph to triumph, and the opposition, I don't know, seemingly being in some sort of disarray, not certainly being in a very strong position. It makes me think, I wanted to ask you about Zoran Mamdani in New York, and well, you know how much attention Zoran's been getting, and the messaging that he's talking about, and so on and so forth. Curious if you have thoughts about that.
Well, I've got a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think it's very significant. I mean, people are very upset. There's a real housing crisis going on. Inflation is been hurting. Inflation in New York, by the way, has been ahead of the national rate for a couple of years. People are hurting, and there's a significant housing crisis, not just in New York, by the way, but throughout the country and really across much of the world. I mean, we just saw protests in Mexico City, which were about the rapidly escalating cost of housing. And, we've seen similar protests in Ireland and in Europe, all over the world, really. And so Mamdani was obviously responding to that. And we'll see what happens in the fall. He makes it into the mayoralty. It's really the maneuvering going on now between Cuomo and Adams is really interesting. But if he makes it into Gracie Mansion, we'll see what happens. But I think that if he does get elected, I think that Trump will declare war, and I think that Mamdani will have a huge fight on his hands. And I'm not at all confident of his ability to wage that fight, but we'll see what happens. And the only way to wage that fight is by mobilizing the working class, and I don't think that Mamdani will do that, but we'll see.
Is there a way, well, I'll put it like this. I wrote something and then scrapped it, pointing out how I didn't like how Mamdani was talking about the U.S. political system. I didn't particularly like the quote that I believe he used from FDR in his victory speech a month or so back, in which FDR says, well, it's when times are tough that people essentially give up the liberties that they have and they choose a strong person to attempt to solve various problems. I just didn't like that position of this is somehow about choice in which people are giving away or handing over the supposed American democracy that they have. I ended up not doing it because it felt like just not the time to throw another critique out there because he's getting hounded by a lot of folks. But if there's some way to use these campaigns, local issues, mayoral candidates, so on and so forth, although this is, of course, New York City, it's not just any city, to talk about constitutional issues or to talk about the political system nationally, if you will.
Well, I mean, I think the point you raise is very interesting. Maybe you were wrong to tear that article up. Maybe you should have gone ahead and published it. I mean, yes. I mean, your point strikes me as absolutely correct. I mean, Americans are not throwing away their democracy. What's happening is that democracy, so-called, is crumbling in their hands. It is woefully short of a true democracy. They have no real control over it. Popular sovereignty doesn't really exist, and so therefore they just sort of are watching helplessly as democracy collapses, or as the constitutional system collapses into authoritarianism. So Mamdani was incorrect. That was a false analysis, and the implication of that statement is we've got to take back our democracy. And that assumes that what we've had is a democracy to begin with. You simply can't say that without acknowledging the severe constitutional crisis that America has fallen into, and of which Trump is a product. He's reflective rather than causative. And that's got to be said, that's got to be stressed over and over and over again. And Mamdani can only defend himself if he mobilizes the working class in favor of fundamental democratic change. But he's not going to do that. He is woefully politically unprepared. First of all, he's a Democrat. I mean, and that itself means that he's he's beholden to this to a wing of the ruling class. I mean, that's a simple fact. And now, by the way, lots of Democratic politicians are flocking to his side, and so therefore he's kind of a popular guy in certain Democratic Party circles. But that is actually not a good thing.
Yeah, that's the other problem I'm sure that people are wary of is discussion around the Democratic Party, putting a new face on the Democratic Party, showing how, the Democratic Party can run a city. Again, we'll see what happens in November, but at least just throwing out things that he said. And I think it's really tempting that there's an understandable desire within certain sections of the left, we can say, to see the process of change as what I think is too much within a local sort of level. Let's get as many local people elected. Let's kind of focus on local issues, local problems when we're talking with people, and we can sort of save the national political system stuff for another time. Or we sort of need to build a critical mass of people outside of the national political questions like the Constitution before we can sort of engage with those particular problems. And to me, it just seems, I have various critiques of that, but on the one hand, it just seems like a dereliction of duty in a certain sense to point out a problem that exists in the Constitution and how the federal system works, and to sort of say, well, we'll save that, or, well, we're not even really sure if it connects to what's happening on the ground, so on and so forth. So
it's absurd.
Yeah,
it's absolutely absurd. Yeah, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, it completely defies political logic, and it immobilizes, it immobilizes the broad popular forces. I mean, the whole purpose is to make, the whole goal of politics is to make them see the connections. That's the point. We've got to show them that it's an integrated whole, a single package. That, that what happens in Washington, reflects what is reflected, in what happens in New York, and vice versa. We've got to be drawing connections all the time, and to somehow insist that there is no necessary connection is exactly the wrong thing to do.
Talking about connections, I wrote something about the use of the U.S. flag, the stars and stripes, and using certain symbols. We've also talked about slogans and phrases before. You've written articles about this topic for the blog. And I didn't disagree with the comment that you left on that article saying, well, look, you also have to consider how the flag has an association with imperialism abroad, at home too, how it is a clear depiction of the 50 state, or just the state system that in the U.S. context is highly, highly federalized, and how out of a constituent assembly, something new might emerge, a new flag, a new conception of what the nation is, so on and so forth. But I have been thinking of, in the meantime, in the lead up to that, kind of bringing us to that point, what our relationship could be, how we should think about popular symbols, slogans. And it was just so clear, the need to at least consider that after the No Kings protest, in which there were a lot of people out there showing displeasure, and you talked about critiques of it, with U.S. flags, some of them right side up, some of them upside down, also with some of them giant reproductions of the Constitution.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, there are no shortcuts. That's the most important thing to bear in mind. There are no magic formulas that will make our path any easier. The path before us is at once very simple and at the same time very complicated. I mean, anybody out there who thinks seriously about the U.S. Constitution for more than a minute and a half can tell you what's wrong with it. But they also will say, like, look, this has been in effect for 2.5 centuries, and it's not going to change anytime soon. So therefore, you and your friends, me and you and others like us, can go on, complaining about this or that, and it's all so much hot air because the reality is that nothing's going to change. And that's a good argument. I can't think of any way of immediately countering that argument because they're correct. But that's how change works, Change is impossible, change is impossible, change is impossible. Oops, it just changed, and in retrospect, we knew it all along. So no one knows how change will work, and I think, or when it will work and how it will develop. But in the meanwhile, we can't adulterate our message. for purposes. We can't sell our birthright for a mess of pottage. We can't adulterate our message out of some desire for some short-term boost. The problem with the American flag is that it's sort of, it's a pictorial representation of American federalism, with its 13 stripes and its 50 stars. I mean, those essentially say that that 13 states created this republic, and now 50 states inhabit that republic. And implicit that is somehow the states themselves are constituent elements. And we oppose that because we think there's only one constituent element, and that is the people, the people. And so after the 1789 Constituent Assembly got underway in France, within a matter of I think it's less than a month, they created a new flag. It was the tricolor, and that flag, not only that flag is that the French become the flag of the French Republic, a new flag, but essentially the tricolor became the model for every post-1789 republic to take shape. I mean, the tricolor is now the standard modern flag. People have, there's the Italian flag is green and red. I don't know. But anyways, they all follow that French revolutionary manner. And the U.S. flag does not, because it's a pre-modern flag. I have no doubt that if a constituent assembly takes shape, the question of a national emblem will become a prime order of business, and I am not at all confident the Stars and Stripes will make the grade.
Well, just to keep ping-ponging themes at you, the discussion around small movements that then become big, I've found very inspiring. I don't think you're the only person to do this, but your instance stands in my mind of talking about the abolitionist movement, going back to that period of U.S. history in which there are a relatively small number of people who are fighting for what they think is correct. It's small, it grows, and then becomes quite big. And I think that more people are starting to, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like more people are starting to think about the meaning of Reconstruction and at least some sense of perhaps a missed opportunity around Reconstruction. Did the Civil War end? The need for a third Reconstruction? Perhaps some of that is around the Supreme Court weighing in on the 14th Amendment, a product of the Civil War. Curious if you think that there's an element of the Reconstruction, finish Reconstruction, we need a third Reconstruction. I don't know if that's in the air, if that's in the zeitgeist in any way.
I think it is. I very much think it is. I mean, critiques of Reconstruction have been gathering force since the early in the 20th century, and W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction was a major milestone, but he was not the first. And I think that there's a very healthy strain in American scholarship, which has grown tremendously since the 1960s. Talking about what an immense failure this was, and how the program the Civil War achieved was really a bare bones minimalist program, and that we've got to go back and finish the job. But clearly, finishing the job means doing what Congress failed to do in 1865-68. They passed 3 very important amendments, but they quickly became dead letters, and they otherwise left the structure of American government intact. And in fact, the ex-Confederacy actually in some ways gained more power as a consequence of those changes. Because remember, blacks no longer counted as 3/4 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, but now counted for 5/5 of a person, even though they couldn't vote. So Southerners actually wound up with more power as a consequence. I mean, this is a absolute travesty, and it allowed a reign of terror over Black Americans to continue for close to a century, an absolute outrage. So we've got to go back and finish the job, but we can only finish the job by subjecting American government to a total top-to-bottom review. And we can only do that democratically. We can't do that via Article 5, which allows infinitesimal minorities to block any attempt at constitutional reform. We've got to do it democratically, where we, the people, the majority, gets to create a new constitution from scratch, one which expresses the desires, meets the aspirations of the American population as it now exists. I mean, not only is the U.S. structure undemocratic, it's also racist. Not only does 54% of the population live in those 10 largest states, but I believe the number is 72% of all minorities live in those 10 biggest states, and therefore they're outvoted even more egregiously. Gerrymandering hurts black people in the House. The Electoral College, undercuts black representation in the presidential election process. So we got to change that. And not only to benefit black people, but to benefit everybody, to benefit the broad masses, because they're all shortchanged. They're all increasingly shortchanged by this undemocratic, structure, which is growing more undemocratic, more wildly undemocratic with each passing day. The slogan I put forward, in an article in the blog, was put forward a slogan said, "Down with the dictatorship. Workers demand a new republic." And I think they like that. I think it's still pretty good. In other words, the working class must be the prime mover in this process, and it must demand a democracy. It must create a democracy which is geared to the needs of the working class first and foremost.
Well, to close out, I wanted to talk about, or just touch on briefly, the demand for a constituent assembly. It could be that either other people besides yourself or what have you have been thinking about this idea, and they're sort of coming out and talking about it a little bit more. Could be a mixture too of the idea spreading to some extent. But I talk with many people on the Democratic Constitution podcast, and recently, for example, spoke with Stephen Pimpare, who wrote an article about the failings of the Constitution. And he's another person who, like Erwin Chemerinsky, though I have my critiques of what Chemerinsky proposes as an alternative, looks at Article 5 and says, well, surely this can't be the way that we resolve these problems. Chemerinsky at least proposes another system that I think has other problems, but at least there's a recognition of, okay, we have problems, and the formal way of resolving these problems isn't going to get us what we need. And I find myself using a slogan or a phrase that I've heard you use, which is, there's no constitutional way to solve the Constitution's problems. There's no constitutional way out of this mess. And then, of course, there also seems to be a misconception, perhaps, that one encounters when one talks about or critiques the Constitution. There is usually the response of, do you think Article 5, what if the states controlled this process? All that to say that there still is a connection in people's minds between critiquing the Constitution and calling for an Article 5 convention.
I think that's correct. I mean, actually, Sanford Levinson, who has done some of the really greatest work in this area. I know him a bit personally. He's a terrific guy. He's a sterling liberal. What that means is that checks and balances, constitutional guardrails, etc., are in his DNA. And I think Levinson at one point even called for appointing a constitutional committee by lot, of all ridiculous things. And apparently this has been done in places. I think that British Columbia experimented with such a system. And this is crazy. This is ridiculous. That the call for a constituent assembly is a call for a revolution. And it's a recognition that change within the constitutional framework is simply impossible. A constitutional convention would be subject to the same Article 5 restrictions, subject to the same 2/3, 3/4 approval process, and therefore, tiny states would be able to veto it and nothing would get done. The whole thing would just be another giant flop. What we have to have is a radical assertion of popular sovereignty, where we, the people, demand the right to elect a constituent assembly on the basis of one person, one vote, according to the highest democratic standards in the world, and that means proportional representation. And this constituent assembly must have sovereign power to revamp the Constitution however it so wishes. If it wants to make only do some minor tinkering, that certainly is its right. I would argue against that, but that certainly is its right. But it must have untrammeled democratic majoritarian power to do this. And whether the Constituent Assembly then passes its handwork, submits it to a public referendum for approval, or simply declares itself to be the new government and then submits to re-election, to another election. That's the route I would favor. But the point is that its power must be untrammeled, and that means that it will not operate under existing legal authority, but will do what the founders did in 1787, which essentially is to abrogate that existing legal authority and to create new legal authority on its own. That's what the founders did. It was Article 6 of the Constitution. Article 5 lays out the amending clause. Article 6 says this Constitution shall be considered ratified when approved by 9 states. That was in direct violation of the Articles of Confederation, which are still the law of the land, which said that any constitutional change had to be unanimous. So essentially, the founders broke existing law in order to create a new legal authority. And that is what a constituent assembly must do in the 2020s. It must break existing law in order to create a new sovereign power. And of course, liberals are horrified. What are you saying? We the people could abolish, free speech, could abolish freedom of the press. Think of all the horrible things that a untrammeled democratic majority could do. And the answer is, yeah, they could do that, but the dynamic would clearly be in the opposite direction. I think that the American working class believes very strongly in free speech and all the other democratic rights, and they will fight for free speech. They will fight for free speech against Trump's efforts to restrict it and destroy it. So I think that this must be a democratic revolution, but a democratic revolution in the context of a socialist revolution, in that the working class, in demanding a new republic, will demand a workers' republic that essentially sees the working class, the working masses, as the constituent element, the prime driving force, and will demand a republic which is geared to their needs. And that's how I see the revolutionary process unfolding. And by the way, this undoubtedly does sound like pie in the sky, but I really don't think it is, because I think America is really heading into a severe crisis, which a lot of possibilities are opening up.
Well, Dan, thanks as always for coming on and talking with us and sharing your thoughts about where things stand, and really encourage folks to check out your books, check out the articles that you've written on your personal blog, also on the Democratic Constitution blog, and your analysis. Go ahead.
So I also write for a site called permanentrevolution.org.
That's right.
Permanent-revolution.org. So you can find a lot of my stuff there as well.